much. First of all, it's indeed a privilege to come here and chair such an amazing looking panel. But I'd like to first of all begin by congratulating you, Chris, and your team for once again pulling off such an amazing conference. I was able to attend the keynote this morning, and to get the type of insights and shared knowledge that was provided was just truly outstanding in that particular regards. And I'm looking at what we have headed going ahead. I'm equally impressed with the subject matter that we have on this panel dealing with human security. We can see certain linkages that we'll have a chance to talk about and integrate in terms of our discussions at the end. In the order that people will be speaking, we have three very interesting looking topics. We'll be starting off with Jake Steiner, who will be talking on COVID-19, vaccine diplomacy, and the conceptual anyway, coming up with the concept of security. Going to get that word out eventually. You can read the detailed bibliographies, but he's working on his MA in Economics and International Relations at the University of St. Andrews. That will be then followed by Max Bombarde, who will be talking about querying the UK asylum procedures for LGBTQ and SOGI people. He is also at the University of St. Andrews, and he is pursuing a Master's of Lit in Security Studies. The third talk will be by Brandon Narayan, talking about using predictive data analysis to prevent mass atrocity crimes through the empowerment of regional organization and BIPOC in the global south. So we have three amazing topics coming through, and I'm very much looking at 13 because Chris is and me. If I'm not keeping us on a further ado, you may proceed. Oh boy, I'm frozen.
Yeah, you cut out there a little bit.
Yeah, we were cutting in and out a bit.
Yeah,
we're good to go.
Jake Steiner. Yeah, I think Jake, you're good to go here.
All right, thanks, Chris. I'm just going to start by sharing some slides. All right, let's do this. All right, good afternoon to everyone. Good evening to those of you who are in St. Andrews. My name is Jake Steiner. I am a current fourth year at the University of St. Andrews and a research fellow at the Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, which is housed under the Department of Defense and located in Honolulu, Hawaii. So the topic of my presentation today is essentially answering the question, how, if at all, has the conception of security changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic? And this is important for looking into the future because how we understand security, how we conceptualize security, impacts how we understand the threat, and by extension, impacts how we respond to the threat in the future, as we'll see through this presentation. So first off, just going through the competing conceptions of security. National security is the incumbent, and human security is a more recent phenomenon arising by several Scandinavian countries and I believe Canada as well. So national security is pretty self-explanatory, defending the nation against specific military threats, responding to, for example, North Korean missile launches, etc. Human security, by contrast, is a sort of combination of advocacy, because it is the challenger, as well as combination of advocacy and academia. It holds the individual as the referent object of security, regardless of their physical location, transcending state boundaries. And in general, I like to use Thomas and Tau's delineation of general versus specific threats. So whereas national security would respond primarily to the threat of COVID-19 within a state, human security would address the general threat of the provision of public health and disparate access to public health, especially in lower and middle income countries. So when it comes to infectious disease and human security, infectious disease has a long history as part of the human security dialogue. ranging back to the UNDP report of 1994 and the 03 Commission on Human Security. Like I said in the previous slide, broadly speaking, human security advocates will call for building public health capacity in low and middle income countries. And there is a specific concern for co-optation because high income countries control a lot of the supply related to global public health, vaccines, masks, etc. There is the possibility for extraction or injecting great power politics into the provision of global public health. So when we're looking at methodology, I'm not going to go into specific cases for time, but we're going to be extracting specific examples from specific cases. And those cases are the People's Republic of China, the United States, and France. This is a supply side examination simply because the study originated in 2021 and thus there was less opportunity to study demand, but I'll get into that in opportunities for further research. I am considering actions taken in a broader political and geopolitical context through the aspects shown there, which I will get to throughout the rest of the presentation. So we're talking about continuity and change over time. We got to go back to the last pandemic, which was H1N1, also known as swine flu. And in this instance, high-income countries practiced what is retroactively referred to as vaccine hoarding. That is, essentially, they bought up the entire supply of the vaccine and only really provided it to poorer countries after determining that they themselves had enough and after H1N1 was determined to not be as bad as previously thought. But since then, there has been a significant shift in moral acceptability when it comes to providing vaccines. And this is primarily via the creation of the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator and COVAX via the organizations here. COVAX, of course, is the international mechanism for equitable distribution of vaccines, practicing collective purchasing and worldwide distribution. We also see a shift in public opinion. For example, this is an opinion poll of several high-income countries, broadly favoring, with pretty large majorities, distributing vaccines according to who needs them most and according to who can't afford it. This is broadly coming to the similar conclusion, but with the United States specifically. But this sort of human security, vaccine solidarity approach has been significantly undermined by high-income countries through vaccine diplomacy. First off, through advanced purchasing agreements. This is essentially the same thing as we saw in H1N1, in that high-income countries, like the first four countries here, have reserved large portions of vaccine supply. Now, vaccine doses are a finite resource. You can only produce so much in the world in a given time. And in turn, this vaccine hoarding drives up prices for remaining doses through scarcity and price anchoring. Simply, the high-income countries are willing to pay a higher price, and therefore that is the price that will be charged through COVAX. In addition, the timing of vaccine doses has a lot to do with the interpretation of security, because if vaccine doses are provided to the world after a majority of people in the donor country have been vaccinated, then that shows a priority to the donor country citizens over this sort of conception that transcends state boundaries and supposedly holds all people equal regardless of national affiliation. So here we have two dates. First, the announcement of the first major US donation of 80 million doses. So that's May 17, 2021, which I show on this daily count of total doses in blue. And then also we have another date by the end of June here, and that is in red. And what we're seeing here is there is a significant decline in demand by the time that these announcements are made, meaning that there is a very clear priority to American citizens first, and then only donating once that domestic demand starts to decline. Next, there's the issue of transfers for geopolitical gain. Even if donor countries do distribute the vaccines, it matters to whom they are distributing them to and for what purpose. For example, from the French case, and this is actually a big reason why I include the French case in the first place, President Emmanuel Macron urged Europe to send vaccines to Africa. This came in February 2020, so timing's not an issue. But what's the purpose of these donations? It's primarily, in Macron's own words, this is an exclusive interview with the Financial Times, an effort to counter Chinese and Russian influence as they distribute their own vaccines. The Chinese case is interesting because not only are we seeing Chinese distribution to pretty well-known Chinese partners, I'll just highlight Cambodia, Myanmar, and a bunch of others, Pakistan as well. But also, the Chinese Communist Party has a significant state interest in providing global public goods as it starts to assert its claim to great power status. So we'll talk about why this is important later in the conclusions. But also, this last case shows probably the most explicit quid pro quo throughout this pandemic, in that Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte retained the visiting forces agreement, essentially, as this Bloomberg report shows, as a concession for vaccine doses. So again, pretty explicit quid pro quo. And so when it comes to transfers for geopolitical gain, it violates the principle of equity because we're not distributing based on greatest need anymore. It's based on what can the donor gain from the recipient country from this donation, either through extracting concessions, reinforcing alliances, and strategic partnerships in the case of the Chinese, and provision of global public goods in pursuit of great power status in the case of China. But wait, there's more. Because there's also the issue of boosters. So the head of the World Health Organization in September 2021 called for high-income countries to not offer booster shots and instead donate those vaccines to low and middle-income countries. Did they listen? Not really. So even more so, we're seeing this prioritization of citizens in high-income countries versus other countries, because this is prioritizing the third dose of an American citizen, for example, versus the first dose for a citizen in a low and middle income country in many instances. So, broad conclusions: how, if at all, has the conception of security changed because of the COVID-19 pandemic? Barely, if at all. There is, yes, a shift in moral acceptability. Vaccines have been donated and distributed a lot quicker than H1N1 via the COVAX mechanism, but we're also seeing the concern for the co-optation of health security becoming a reality, not only through the prioritization of a country's own citizens, but also because donations and exports are now for geopolitical gain versus any notion of solidarity. In addition, it's an effort, there's no real effort at sort of capacity building, but we could see that in the next couple of years as we get to an endemic phase of the pandemic. But right now we're reacting to the specific threat of the pandemic instead of the wider threat of provision of global public health. So ultimately, where state interests and solidarity clash, state interests tend to always win. But this does give us an out in terms of those advocates for human security, because the Omicron variant showed us that a threat anywhere is in fact a threat anywhere. A threat anywhere is a threat everywhere, in that even with, double dose Pfizer American citizens with boosters in the United States, hospitalizations still went up around the world and in the high income countries as well. When it comes to China, they've been providing a lot of vaccines, exporting a lot of vaccines to a lot of different countries because the state interests and the solidarity align. And so that means when it comes to advocating for human security, one needs to demonstrate that the state interest aligns with the solidarity or human security aspect. This can be done electorally by calling on leaders to provide. In that case, it's in the leader's interest to donate because it hurts their electoral chances otherwise. Just bring it back to the Omicron variant. This evidence probably does a lot to advance the human security narrative and conception in future pandemics. Now, there is an opportunity to further expand this sort of idea of COVID-19 and the conception of security, and that's to observe the demand side. For example, I would question, is there a shift in recipient country behavior once vaccines are delivered? Typo there, apologies. But there is the potential that human security is co-opted on the demand side, in that they're using the human security narrative to pressure high-income countries without any effort at building capacity later on. And so we'll see, is the sort of call for greater donations lessened in countries where they have received vaccine doses in the future, as well as we progress into the endemic phase, sort of the capacity building aspect can be greater observed now that the specific threat is less of an issue. So that's all I have for today. Wow, 1336, not bad at all. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Jake, for a very fascinating study, if not challenging to some of the existing literature out there. So well done. Okay, I now like to pass the chair over to, or the floor over to Max. Max, you may proceed.
Hi, yeah, I'm Max. I'm an MLit student at the University of St. Andrews as well. It's going to be a tough presentation to follow. Mine is not as colorful. Here we go. So I looked at querying the asylum procedure for LGBTIQ+, or as they're referred to, SOGI, which is an unfortunate acronym, but it stands for Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Refugees. So this all started in June 2021, after things began opening up for the first time after COVID. I attended the Vienna Pride celebration, which is called the Rainbow Parade, sort of like beyond just gay parade. I don't know how many of you have attended these events, but there's usually like a vast amount of flags and banners with various like tongue-in-cheek, pun intended type slogans on them. And this particular time, I noticed one of the banners said, "Am I gay enough for you?" And I found this a little bit odd, so obviously did some Googling, discovered that a lot of refugees who seek asylum on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity are asked to prove that they're gay, and they're quite often refused asylum if the procedures decide that they're not gay enough. So this system entails invasive questioning, dehumanizing practices in order to determine whether they truly are gay and if they're gay enough. So basically they can be told, well, we believe that you're gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, whatever, but we believe that you've done a great job of hiding it so far, so just go back home and keep it up. And this isn't a small issue either. I looked mainly at the UK just because of the scope of the study, but I also looked at stuff in Italy and Germany. But basically in the UK, there's this great group called the UK Lesbian and Immigration Group that reviewed a bunch of casework and found that 98% of cases were refused at the initial interview. And of those that got through, over 50% of them were rejected in the end. So basically filing for asylum on other grounds, such as political beliefs or religion, typically offers a better chance of success. So how do we look at this issue academically and hopefully constructively? So a few questions to help guide us here, namely, which norms inform the asylum system, its related rights and procedures, and, as we'll see in a bit, how can we make sense of the seemingly paradoxical grounds stated in the asylum rejections? So in the next few minutes, we'll take a look at the contextualization of the asylum system, identify the involved practices, and apply the lens of queer theory to make sense of the issue. By looking at queer identities and concepts of visibility and intelligibility, we're seeking to queer the asylum system itself. To discover the root cause of these paradoxes, though, I think it's essential to look at the Refugee Convention. So that's like the legal side to asylum and where all this mess starts, basically. So when the Refugee Convention was drawn up in 1951, and then the protocol in 1967, they didn't explicitly list individuals being persecuted for their sexual or gender identity, sexual orientation or gender identity. So personally, I find this a little bit weird and quite telling, given that the convention was drawn up after World War II, where there are well-documented crimes against humanity, and that includes the LGBT community. And queer theory would suggest that this omission is rooted in the modern nation state's heterosexist foundations. So in this situation, there isn't a category for soggy individuals, so they're considered part of the particular social group category, here listed as PSG. So this distinction means that they have to meet two criteria. One, they have to share a common immutable characteristic, so like a special gene or the compulsive need to name apples as their favorite fruit, or just being compelled to dance when an ABBA song plays. And two, they have to be recognizably different, i.e. they wear jeans all the time, just whenever. So why does the modern nation state erase the existence of LGBTIQ individuals? Because their existence threatens the heterosexist and heteronormative ideal based on group reproduction and stable binary identities. And queer asylum seekers are a double threat because they're additionally foreign, outsiders, they're the other. So by existing, they destabilize the figuration of the patriarchal state as a family unit and shake the foundations of the established and gendered regime of visibility that we have in place, which opens up the public space to the masculine or heterosexual or cis, and relegates to the private space that which is feminine, homosexual, or otherwise queer. So how is it that the refugee procedure that was meant to protect those being oppressed ended up being so lacking in a basic understanding of queer existence? Well, the Human Rights Project, of which asylum is part, is built on establishing normative boundaries for essentialized identities, whereas queer is anti-normative. Queer identities, by definition, I really like this one by Sedgwick, cannot be made to signify monolithically. They are an open mesh of possibilities, gaps, overlaps, dissonances, and resonances, lapses and excesses of meaning. This means they cannot be made to have an immutable characteristic, basically. Queer theory is particularly helpful in this scenario because it opens up the investigation into concepts of performativity and intelligibility and how they're applied to the soggy asylum seekers, which relates directly to the second criteria of the PSG. So the asylum regulations, as they currently stand, they're premised on, firstly, monolithic either-or logics, i.e. heterosexual, homosexual, male, female, good, bad, and secondly, on the recognizability of these identities. And this is problematic right off the bat because these understandings, they're rooted in like UK and Western stereotypes of queerness, manifesting Western heteronormative standards. So it's a backwards understanding of like gay men in jeans and lesbian women as mechanics, for example. And these stereotypes are themselves rooted in these specific regimes of invisibility and intelligibility, meaning they're both blind to the asylum seekers' culturally specific strategies of avoiding persecution by attempting to blend in and conform to what's normal in their society, and performing identities, so attempting to present as appropriately queer in their society. So when they seek asylum in a different country, they have to switch that and discover what's normal in the new society and what's queer in the new society. So queer bodies, queer identities have to make sense or fit, otherwise they provoke censure. And the asylum procedures require that soggy applicants' performativity be different from heteronormative society, while also being intelligible in the sense of conforming to established stereotypes. So they're asking them to be different and not fit in, which puts them in danger, and to conform to these unknown stereotypes. So regarding stable identities, queer identities constitute a sense of a site of resistance, against heterosexism and heteronationalism, in as much as they constantly cross and disrupt the borders of ideologically recognized and valued kinds of bodies. Now, in the UK, this manifested as discretion reasoning until they decided that was unethical and then switched to discretion by choice, which is the exact same thing with a different name, where essentially they told refugees that they could avoid persecution because of their sexual orientation or gender identity by being more discreet in the future. And this particularly affected bisexual people or women because they were sort of perceived as being naturally more discreet anyway. And such state-imposed invisibility, manifests the heterosexist regime of invisibility that assigns non-conforming identities to the private space. And regarding the second point, intelligibility and visibility, the UK asylum system demands that SOGI applicants be both visible and separate, and it rests on the continued othering of queer people. It demands their complicity. It asks them to adopt stereotypes that are dehumanizing and just fake. And the gendered body has to be intelligible to society and its institutions in order to matter. So to be recognized and accepted as a subject with rights. So obviously there's a massive paradox between these 2 points. So the key findings, conclusions of all of this is that there's a clash between epistemologies, so positivist, deterministic versus queer and fluid, but also between the regimes of visibility in place. In the UK Home Office's practices, this manifests in asking them to prove some immutable and innate characteristic that all SOGI people share. A special gene, apples is their favorite fruit, something like that. And this simplistic, and reductionist thinking erases the complexity and the diversity of the LGBTIQ+ community, and it sterilizes their political potential. It safely stows them away in a box that's labeled other. It relegates them to the private realm. And in addition, the Home Office's conceptualization of an identifiable gay is steeped in Western stereotypes that misrepresent Western LGBTIQ+ people and apply even less to those from different cultures. So inasmuch as it remains unintelligible, queer performativity radically challenges heteronormative systems through the persistent queering of performativity, queering here as a verb to change. So asking SOGI applicants to perform an identity that's both stable and unchangeable, as well as satisfies Western intelligibility standards, is asking them to perform in a coerced manner, as well as against the social norms of the host country. Now, following Dawson, who did a great study looking at Italy and Germany, the asylum system could be considered what she calls an anxiety controlling mechanism, in the sense that it works to safeguard and reassure the heterosexist nation state by regulating queer identities. So I think what I'm really getting at here is that in a system characterized by an extreme power asymmetry, so the asylum system, the institutions of the state literally decide who is tolerated and who is not, who matters, in Butler's words. So from the perspective of queer theory, the identities, experiences, and practices of queer people refuse to be categorized, tested, and brought into the fold of the heterosexist nation state. And that's all I have for today. Hopefully it wasn't too theory heavy.
Wow, another outstanding. Is definitely some very interesting insights, particularly on your conclusions on the epistemology elements of how that policy is developed. Wow. Okay, well, moving on now, we have our last speaker. Brandon, take it away.
Definitely. All righty, let's hope that's up and running, everyone can see. So my name is Brandon Narayan. I just graduated from the University of Utrecht, getting an LLM in public international law. I'm currently in a fast track master's. I'm waiting to my PhD in philosophy at University of Ottawa. All right, so this is a brief roadmap, but I am going to get into the thick of it. So there's gridlock faced by the United Nations Security Council. Oh, I should also mention, My topic today is using predictive data analytics to prevent mass atrocity crimes through the empowerment of women and POC in the Global South. So currently, the Security Council must be able to find consensus, especially among the P5, to decisively address, prevent, and respond to mass atrocity crimes and protect civilians when their host state fails to do so. However, as a lot of us probably know, this has not been the case. The well-documented central cause for the Security Council's impediments to upholding commitments to the international regime of peace and security is ultimately due to conflicting geopolitical goals, which they often use their positions in the council to accomplish. The unlimited use of vetoes, for example, in the face of mass atrocity crimes has created a disconnect, contributing to some of the core issues with the UNSC, namely that they're seen as inconsistent and predictable and pretty much leading to gross inaction. This has severely impaired its credibility in the eyes of the wider UN membership and the public as well. Moreover, another shortcoming of the UNSC is a failure to really implement policies and actions that treat climate change as a threat multiplier and seeing its links to mass atrocity crimes. The notion of climate change and mass atrocity crimes isn't new. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan argued in his Millennium Report that climate change, and I quote, may increase social and political tensions in unpredictable and potentially dangerous ways. In 2014, the US Department of Defense described climate change as a threat multiplier, noting that a rise in global temperatures may intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict, and that poses a particular threat to regions and nations in the Global South. There have been numerous IPCC reports as well that really stress the dire environmental effects that will exacerbate ongoing ethnic, religious, and other interstate tensions, and how all these issues will degrade stability and limit the ability of countries to protect their population. Moreover, the IPCC, one of their general findings in their new 2022 report is that climate change can also increase competition for dwindling land and water resources, which could exacerbate conflict between groups. The UN has a framework of analysis for atrocity crimes that doesn't explicitly mention the effects of global warming. However, they do mention motives or incentives and triggering factors, and this can be interpreted in a climate capacity as well. Motives or incentives could potentially include a dramatic widening of inequality because of climate change, including food and water scarcity, environmental degradation, and the political manipulation of access to these precious resources. The predicted increase in the intensity of climate change as well, and some of the dynamics that I outlined here today, could easily be missed by traditional conflict assessments and tools that do not traditionally consider environmental factors. So it's important to include a capacity that is modern enough to see and highlight climate change and how exactly it contributes to mass atrocity crimes. In instances of mass atrocity crimes that do have grounding in climate change, there's a disproportionate suffering of women and the POC, especially in the global South. So adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience of people to climate change depend on a number of conditions. These vary from degree of exposure and dependency, weather patterns, livelihoods, and food security as well. But women in the South are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of disaster due to skewed power relations and inequitable cultural and social norms. So there's several dynamics at play here. Access to education is one of them. Economic poverty, discrimination in food distribution, food insecurity, limited access to resources. But the one that I want to point out more so than others is their inability to make an influence in decision-making spheres, from domestic to international to regional levels as well. Women generally have far less access to and control over the resources they depend on, nor do they have opportunities for direct governance and effective influence in politics, especially when they're facing the brunt of the impacts as well. Climate change has a greater impact on those sections of the population in all countries that are more reliant on natural resources for their livelihoods. And this is based on gender, class, race, physical ability, and educational level as well. So both POC and women are affected here. 12 perspectives on this linkage. 12 is third world approach to international law. Matua in 2000 did a great job of summing it up, and it's centered around decolonization. To understand the the oppressive nature of the inaction of the UNSC, the inability of the international peace and security infrastructure to really acknowledge the links between climate change and mass atrocity crimes, that there has to be a certain way to eradicate the conditions of underdevelopment in the third world through scholarship, policy, and politics. Moreover, that they need to construct and present an alternative normative legal edifice for international governance. Sovereignty is a key notion that is called into question through climate change and mass atrocity crimes. So with no help from the current regime centered around the UNSC, there has to be a way for these states to still stay true to their sovereignty while mitigating these effects and preventing it from turning into mass atrocities. Feminist perspectives, they emphasize women's unique role in being proactive adaptation actors and not just victims needing protection. However, women also provide vital hope for successful adaptation through their critical knowledge, experience, agency, and unique role in agriculture, food security, and income generation as well. Women play such important roles in both participating in resources and helping societies bloom from within, but they're left out of decision-making processes. So a lot of policymakers lack the vital resource there. They don't give women opportunities, or enough opportunities at least, to affect policy in a more meaningful and active way. So women must be seen as agents of change and must be able to benefit from their diverse investments into the communities and societies. This leads me to assuming a role of predictive data analytics as a way forward. The first benefit that comes from predictive data analytics is there's a shift from a post-crisis framework to a preventative framework. So the damaging narrative of victimhood when it comes to women gets put aside completely because we don't let it get to that point quite yet. And it's a more holistic, consistent, and immediate method of providing efficient humanitarian aid and the protection of civilians by bolstering prevention and diffusing situations before they become a mass atrocity. There's a role of incorporating data into dimensions of international peace and security, especially humanitarian support, which integrates methods of, it makes it more automatic methods, which have great promise in the realm of security as well. Moreover, predictive data analytics also helps circumvent the UNSC gridlock through the use of regional organizations. Although regional organizations like the UNSC have competing norms and interests, there's also incentive for these organizations to improve their technological infrastructure through multilateral partnerships and endeavors that they're more willing to participate with one another in a non-crisis context. And secondly, I had to cut out some case studies just for the sake of time. But there are regional organizations that have seen mass atrocities. I'm thinking Syria, Darfur, Sudan, and Myanmar with the Rohingya crisis. So that calls into the League of Arab States, the African Union, and ASEAN as well. These states have a lot of norms, and they all have different ways of competing norms in their regions. However, they have all agreed that that there is an importance surrounding the protection of civilians, and they all have shown an aversion to violence and conflict as well. So this is a way to ensure that their values and norms are being upheld, but not in a situation that threatens their stability. Moreover, there's more opportunity for racial and gender biases to be acknowledged and handled with predictive data analytics. In general, it can close gender gaps between men, women, and gender and sexual minorities in various ways, such as monitoring, recruiting, predicting, reducing bias, and educating. In closing these gaps and providing states with the resources to understand this data and implement them, the role of women in GSM in all fields, let alone peace and security, will increase. And moreover, when it comes to violence as well, sexual violence and gender-based violence, predictive data analytics helps create a more holistic approach, because there is a correlation as well between climate change and domestic and sexual-based violence. We see it in the 2013 UNFPA document on the role of data in addressing violence against women and girls. We see it a heavy emphasis on holding perpetrators responsible and having a way to discuss the experiences of women and their experiences, as well as men and boys, and using data to ensure their safety in a way that is safe for everybody. Moreover, PDA can be seen by 12 perspectives as being a good start in closing the gap between the global north and global south, with the sharing of technology and capacity building in the field of security. And lastly, the current infrastructure is in place for predictive data analytics and a role in security. With the emergence of PDA alongside already established technological infrastructure, this is a quote from Tommaso Suave. He's a legal professor in Vienna. He notes that it is now possible to confidently forecast where and when a crisis will strike, how many people it will affect, and what needs it will create. So it allows for a more swift and accurate humanitarian relief effort and the potential to prevent a situation from escalating to a mass atrocity. Moreover, the drivers behind the implementation of PDA and human security discourse were primarily NGOs and governments, but the UN was very quick to get involved as well. The Center for Humanitarian Data, created by the OCHA, focused on 4 areas, which was data services, which was the management of the humanitarian data exchange, data literacy, which increases the capacity for humanitarian actors to understand and work with data, data responsibility, which was the safe, ethical, and effective management of personal and non-personal data for humanitarian response, and predictive data analytics, which gather and analyze current and historical data to anticipate events and anticipate an event using models to gain insight and trigger automatic measures for the earliest possible response. So some conclusions that I've drawn from this is that the Security Council is becoming more obsolete and is lacking in their response times. Climate change does not necessarily need more policies, but more action regarding its role in enabling mass atrocity crimes on both domestic and international levels. Women in POC have a crucial and unique role to play in the mitigation of mass atrocity crimes because they are often left to take the brunt of the negative consequences of climate change. Their input to policymakers and initiatives are invaluable. And lastly, predictive data analytics seems more and more likely to become a game changer and a lifesaver to alleviate some of the security burdens caused by both climate change and mass atrocities. Predictive data analytics must be actively pursued, and this requires strong multilateral efforts through local, regional, and international institutions. Thank you very much for your time.
Wow.
The world changed suddenly on February 24th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine is a sovereign nation born after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1992, when the people of Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, voted to gain their independence, and the Russian Federation accepted that decision. In the last 30 years, Ukraine has looked both east to Russia and west to Europe. Once a thoroughly corrupt society, Ukraine has in the last decade or so evolved into a liberal democracy with increasing aspirations to join both NATO and the European Union. It became a modern society integrated in both socioeconomic and mercantile ways with its European neighbors. The Russian dictator, President Vladimir Putin, raged against Ukraine's growing Western connections, especially the possibility, acknowledged by NATO but never acted upon, that it might one day join NATO. While Russia under Putin became a near clone of communist Russia in the Soviet Union, Ukraine moved the other way. After a decade-long effort to modernize the Russian military, Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine with some 150,000 plus troops. Ukrainians were and are utterly determined to defend their sovereignty and are fighting back stubbornly. The war has been a disaster for Ukraine. Thousands have been killed, and many of its cities have been completely leveled by indiscriminate Russian bombing. Putin's war broke the long peace in Europe, beginning in 1945, a peace marred only by the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, wars that, although very bloody, involving instances of ethnic and religious genocide, were limited in scope by the fact that no major power was involved. But Putin's war on Ukraine was fought by the Russians with great brutality, and is fought by the Russians, and war crimes, I think, plain for all of us to see, committed against civilians with the leveling by air attacks and artillery of large tracts of major Ukrainian cities. By attacking Ukraine with a massive force, Putin provoked NATO and much of the rest of the world to withdraw from Russia, for major oil companies such as Shell and Exxon Mobil to hamburger giant McDonald's to coffee giant Starbucks to virtually all major credit cards, the West began a near global boycott of Russia. Vladimir Putin threatened a nuclear response, hinted at the use of chemical and biological weapons in Ukraine, and declared that the many sanctions leveled at Russia amounted to a declaration of war. The very fact that a major nuclear power openly attacked a peaceful neighbor would have roiled the international scene, but the attack was compounded by two significant questions. One, would Russia soon attack any or all NATO nations that were, until the early 1990s, Soviet satellite states? Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, all of whom are now in NATO. Had Russia now permanently rejected the major tenets of the international system, which held that member states would not change borders by force of arms? No one can say what Putin's plans are, but it's clear from his actions that he is intent on burying the second of those two tenets. Canada has been a NATO member since signing the Treaty of Washington in the summer of 1949. Indeed, Canada, the US, and Great Britain began to discuss a North Atlantic alliance as early as January 1948. At one time, Canada made land, sea, and air contributions to NATO that were at least appropriate for a country of Canada's size, economy, and strategic challenges. Canada also began forging ties with the United States for the defense of North America in August 1940 that are the foundation of thousands of different defense agreements and arrangements between Canada and the United States, including the North American Aerospace Defense Command and the North Warning System designed to locate air and space threats in the skies of North America. In the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, several NATO nations began to send weapons, such as man-fired anti-tank and anti-aircraft rockets, into Ukraine. The main suppliers were the United States and Britain. Canada sent some lethal equipment, but part of the allotment was obsolete, decades-old Carl Gustav anti-tank weapons. The United States sent thousands of troops to shore up the defense of Europe, especially to the Baltic states, and reiterated to Putin that it stood ready to enforce Article 5 of the NATO agreement. An attack against one NATO nation is an attack against all NATO nations. Several NATO nations indicated that defense spending would increase. Germany canceled the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, announced a program of energy diversification to wean them off of Russian gas, and added some 30% to its defense budget in 1 year. The Cold War is back, with the distinct possibility that President Putin will make a grab for NATO territory, particularly in the Baltic. He has already started to militarize the Arctic Ocean and turn it into a Russian littoral. The sudden shift in global geopolitics now taking place is somewhat akin to the shock of the North Korean attack against South Korea in 1950. There, on June 25, 1950, North Korean military forces, equipped largely by the USSR, attacked South Korea in an effort to unite the Korean peninsula under Soviet control. When a UN counterattack threw the North Koreans back in the fall, China intervened in the war in November 1950, only to be pushed back to the original ceasefire line near the 38th parallel by mid-1951. The North Korean attack was seen in NATO capitals as a test of the then one-year-old alliance. If the communists succeeded in Korea, Russia might try something similar in Central Europe. The US, Britain, and Canada began an immediate increase in defense spending. Canadians were as caught by surprise as anyone. Just 5 years after the greatest military effort in Canadian history, war suddenly loomed again for the people of Canada. Canadians were in the midst of a post-war boom. Returning veterans were building families. They were buying homes in new subdivisions, purchasing new cars for the first time since the start of the Second World War, and beginning to enjoy a peaceful, prosperous life. Suddenly, war. And the prospect of a much wider war, unless NATO armed itself to the teeth and confronted the Red Menace all along the Iron Curtain in Europe. The key word on everyone's mind was deterrence, and Canada had to play its part, not only because Washington and London insisted that Canada share the burden, but because a large majority of Canadians from coast to coast pressed the government to become involved. By August 1950, Canada had committed an army brigade to fight in Korea, dispatched 3 destroyers to Korean waters to patrol the coasts under American and British command, and detailed a transport squadron to fly supplies to Japan for shipment to Korea from the West Coast. By early 1951, Canadian troops joined the fight at the front in Korea. Eventually, over 25,000 Canadians served there, and more than 500 Canadians lost their lives. The Canadian defense budget ballooned from around $6 billion in 1950-1951 to $13.5 billion by 1954-55. In other words, it doubled in 4 years. To avoid rapid inflation, taxes were raised and programs were cut to accommodate the increase in military spending. So, at a surprise, defense became a #1 priority. The total number of personnel in the Canadian military went from under 50,000 in 1948 to over 150,000 by 1955 in a nation of only 15.6 million people. It was a sizable expenditure. More than 40% of the Canadian budget went to defense. Canada's defenses today are not as pitiful as they were in 1950, but they are as inadequate as they have been for many years. In 1960, defense accounted for over 4% of Canada's GDP. Today, the figure is 1.39%. If Canada were to double its current defense expenditures in 4 years, as it did after the outbreak of the Korean War, the defense budget would increase from its current $28.7 billion to $45 billion or so in 4 years. Why is this necessary? Because the current state of the military is deplorable. Canada has no modern fighter aircraft and has yet to choose between the Swedish Saab Gripen and the American Lockheed Martin F-35. The Halifax-class patrol frigates are approaching 30 years old. The Royal Canadian Navy has no military auxiliary support ships, though it has 1 civilian ship leased to the Navy and a second is proposed, neither of which will be able to enter a conflict zone. Canada currently possesses 4 diesel-electric submarines built in British shipyards near the end of the Cold War, which can barely soar T3 at any one time, and none have under ice capability. The full-time military is 5,000 personnel short of establishment that means almost 12%. The Army has no anti-aircraft capability and only obsolete anti-tank weapons. It will take hundreds of millions of dollars to upgrade the North Warning System, and the government has not allocated any funds for that purpose. And the beat goes on. Canada is as unready to face the challenge of Cold War 2.0, either as a NATO partner or as a partner with the United States in defending the continent or in defending the Arctic, as it has ever been. Our Arctic coast lies naked to Russian aggression. Our Arctic sea lanes are vulnerable to Russia's ice-breaking capability and under-ice ballistic missile submarines. We can do almost nothing to help our NATO allies or play an appropriate role in defending North America. The several hundred additional troops we have sent to Latvia is, quite frankly, a joke. It is time for a massive increase in our defense budget, paid for with higher taxes, and a deferment of promises made by this government to spend on childcare, pharmacare, and a host of other programs that can now be taken up only after our defenses are at least adequate. There is no time to waste, and we must start now. Thank you. I'll be happy to take any questions if there are.
I don't see any questions, so I will just move on to my own closing remarks here. So thank you, Dr. Berkson, for that. It was a very interesting and timely closing remarks there. And I believe everyone, especially from a Canadian perspective, appreciates your insights there. So with that being said, I am happy to bring the 21st Annual Graduate Strategic Studies Conference to a close now. It has truly been an honor for all of us on the S3C team to have you all here today and yesterday to participate in the conference and build upon the now 21-year-old tradition at the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies. The success, however, of this conference would not be possible alone or without the help of various individuals and organizations. First and foremost, I'd like to thank my team that helped at various points to make this conference possible, with Jordan helping out with the financial side, Davina helping out making the lovely conference program that we have, and Granite, who contributed his ideas, thoughts, and even introduced yesterday's keynote speaker. So thank you to all of them. I would also like to take a moment to thank Megan Martins de Ponte and Alexander McDonald, former CMSS alum in the case of Alex, current in the case of Megan, who both restarted this conference last year after a couple years in hiatus. Similar thanks is also owed to Tim Choi, who at various points answered our questions and concerns for how to run things and the like. So a big thank you to him as well. I would also like to thank the CMSS's current director, Dr. Aaron Gisborne-Brunshot, and CMSS's coordinator, Mary Kathleen Anderson, for their help and support throughout this whole process. And lastly, I would like to thank all of our sponsors who contributed in various ways to make this event possible. In particular, I'd like to give a shout out to the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, who helped us secure Lieutenant General Bose as a speaker for today's keynote, and the Canadian International Council's Young Professionals Network, as well as the North American Arctic Defense and Security Network for their help in promoting the event on various social media outlets. And lastly, but certainly not least, I would also like to thank the conference participants whose submissions and subsequently their presentations formed the backbone of our conference. It was really an honor to have you all come here present your research, and on behalf of the S3C team, I would like to thank you for all the time and effort you exerted to participate today. With that being said, thank you for making this conference a success, and we look forward to seeing you next year to host the 22nd Annual Graduate Strategic Studies Conference. So with that said, we will adjourn for the day, and yeah, thank you all for coming out.